The right to vote is often considered one of the most profound and fundamental rights in a democratic political system. In the United States, voting is often framed as both a duty of citizenship and a public good. And yet, in any given election, only a portion of those eligible to cast a ballot actually do. Indeed, if we look at voter turnout in presidential elections since 1968, we find that the proportion of eligible voters who actually cast a ballot ranges from a low of about 52% in 1996 to a high of about 66% in 2020, with an average of just about 57% over the entire period of time. And participation in mid-year or off-term elections when a presidential election is not taking place is even lower, with somewhere between about 1/3 and 1/2 of all eligible voters participating. And so in this video, we're going to look at the expansion of the right to vote over time in the United States and explore the reasons for relatively low voter turnout. Let's start by looking at the 2020 presidential election a bit more closely. At that time, the United States had a population of about 330 million people, but of those, only about 257 million, or about 78%, were of voting age, that is, were 18 years or older. And of the voting age population, only about 239 million people, or about 72% of the total population, were eligible to vote. Remember that to be eligible, a person must be registered to vote, and in many states cannot have been convicted of a felony. And only about 154 million, or about 2/3 of eligible voters, actually voted. Of those that did vote, about 51% voted for Biden and about 47% voted for Trump. And in practice, that means that neither candidate won a majority of the electorate, and certainly not a majority of the overall population. Indeed, while Biden won the presidency by carrying 51% of the votes cast, he won only about 34% of all eligible voters, only about 32% of the voting age population, and only about 25% of the total population. And this was in an election with one of the highest turnouts in generations. But even this relatively high level of turnout in the United States is well below that of most other developed countries, which often see voter turnout rates in excess of 70%. We can identify a variety of factors that differentiate voters and non-voters at a general level. Individuals with higher levels of education are more likely to vote. This correlation is often attributed to greater awareness of political issues and more resources to overcome potential voting barriers. Older citizens tend to vote at higher rates than younger ones. Young people, especially 18 to 24-year-olds, have historically lower rates of turnout. Racial and ethnic minorities often vote at lower rates, although this varies widely among different groups. This may be due to a range of factors including disenfranchisement, language barriers, or alienation from the political system. People with higher income levels and homeowners are more likely to vote than renters and people with lower incomes. This is often attributed to the ability to get time off of work, access to transportation, and other such factors. Employed individuals are more likely to vote, possibly due to higher socioeconomic status and a stronger connection to policy issues affecting employment and businesses. Married individuals tend to vote at higher rates than single individuals. People with greater social capital, that is, ties to the community, tend to vote at higher rates than people with lower social capital. And finally, voters often feel their participation can make a difference, a sense called political efficacy. They believe that voting is an effective way to voice their opinions and bring about change. By contrast, non-voters often feel disillusioned with the political process, believing their vote doesn't matter or disliking all candidates. And non-demographic factors can influence turnout in any specific election. Perhaps the most important of these factors is the type of election, with presidential elections typically having much higher rates of turnout than off-year elections. Highly competitive races, especially where the outcome is perceived as crucial or uncertain, can also drive higher turnout. The political climate matters as well, with intense political polarization or significant national issues motivating higher turnout. Campaigns and their mobilization efforts matter. Charismatic candidates, or those who successfully address voters' concerns, can increase turnout, as can effective get-out-the-vote or GOTV efforts by those campaigns. Policies like early voting, mail-in voting, and same-day registration can increase turnout, while stricter voter identification requirements can depress turnout, particularly among certain groups. The accessibility of polling stations can also affect turnout. Finally, weather and other external factors can influence turnout levels. Major events or holidays close to Election Day can distract potential voters or make it difficult for them to vote. And inclement weather often decreases voter turnout, especially in regions unprepared for poor weather conditions. The idea of universal suffrage, that all citizens should have the right to vote, is a relatively recent innovation. Indeed, in the early years of the United States, the franchise was largely restricted to white male property owners over the age of 21. These restrictions effectively limited the right to full political participation to about 10% of the population. But over time, the franchise was gradually expanded. Beginning in the 1820s, states began to reduce or eliminate property requirements, significantly expanding the electorate to include most white men. Indeed, by the mid-1800s, a majority of white males could vote. The elimination of property requirements for voting was driven by several factors, the most important of which was the growing pressure from populist movements representing farmers, laborers, and frontier settlers who demanded more equal stake in the political process, accompanied by the westward expansion of the United States, which dispossessed Native Americans of their land, making it readily available to white settlers. Next, passage of the 15th Amendment prohibited denying citizenship on the basis of race, in theory, extending the franchise to all men over the age of 21. In practice, however, discriminatory practices, particularly in the South, effectively disenfranchised many African Americans for decades. Passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, the result of a long struggle for women's suffrage, prohibited denying the right to vote on the basis of sex, granting women the right to vote. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted Native Americans U.S. citizenship and theoretically the right to vote. However, much like after passage of the 15th Amendment, their actual ability to vote was governed by state laws, and many states barred Native Americans from voting until the post-World War II era. Indeed, it wasn't until the 1960s that the franchise truly began to reach near universal levels in the United States. The 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes, fees charged by some states to vote, often used to prevent the poor, particularly African Americans, from voting. The 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes in federal elections, and a 1966 Supreme Court case extended this ban to state elections. But arguably the most important contribution to expanding the franchise to all Americans regardless of race or ethnicity was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans, Native Americans, and others from exercising their right to vote, finally realizing the promise of the 15th Amendment. Ratification of the 26th Amendment in 1971 lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, expanding the electorate to include millions of younger Americans. This amendment was passed in response to the recognition that tens of thousands of young men were being sent to fight in Vietnam, but could not participate in the elections determining the policies governing that war. And more recently still, the American with Disabilities Act, adopted in 1990, included provisions requiring polling places to be accessible and that voting aids and assistance be available for people with disabilities, ensuring their ability to participate in the franchise. As a result of these changes, today nearly all citizens aged 18 and over are eligible to vote, barring certain restrictions. This doesn't mean, however, that all eligible voters are registered or participate in elections, and debates over the franchise continue. Indeed, while the trend has been towards expanding access, there have also been some movements that argue in favor of restricting access to voting. The most notable of these is the temporary or permanent disenfranchisement of persons convicted of felonies. Depending upon state laws, voting rights may be permanently rescinded or may be restored after incarceration, completion of parole, probation, or even after an individual petition. This disproportionately affects minority communities and has long-term implications for civic participation for millions of Americans. In recent years, debate over voter identification laws has also intensified. Some states have strict photo identification requirements for voting, which proponents argue are necessary to prevent voting fraud. Critics, however, argue that such requirements are a form of disenfranchisement, disproportionately affecting minority, elderly, and low-income citizens who may not have the required forms of identification or the means to attain them. The voter registration process itself can present obstacles to voting. Each state has different voter registration rules and deadlines, which can be confusing or restrictive. Some states offer same-day registration, permitting individuals to register on Election Day. Others require registration weeks or even months ahead of Election Day. Some states automatically register citizens to vote, others do not, requiring individuals to take proactive steps to register. And in some states, voters are automatically deregistered if they miss an election, while in others they maintain their voter registration status from election to election. Most states have residency requirements, meaning a person must live in the state for 10 to 30 days or longer in a few cases before being eligible to vote. Some states require a physical residential address to register, which can effectively disenfranchise homeless individuals. Still others require an intent to remain as part of the registration process, which can disenfranchise students or other individuals who are only planning on residing there on a temporary basis. The availability of early voting, mail-in ballots, and the number and accessibility of polling places can vary wildly between states. Restrictions or reductions in these services can make it harder for people, especially working individuals, to vote. These restrictions and barriers contribute to variations in voter turnout and civic engagement across different populations in the United States. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.